I don't know. I don't know. The stupid hackathon in me is like,
There's a thread to me with the critique that the stupid hackathon was making, and that both critiques that are being leveled against NFTs, but also some of the things that NFTs are putting forward.
Yeah, well, for those who aren't familiar, I invented this thing called the Stupid Hackathon. And essentially, we made stupid shit that no one needs and terrible ideas. But the one catch was it had to work. I do feel like a lot of what's happening in the blockchain space and in the decentralized like NFT space feels totally fun, like something I would love to have seen at the Stupid Hackathon, or maybe hopefully some people were inspired, or it's just at least in my same like mind space. And it is interesting how angry and upset people get about it. And I people did the same thing with the stupid hackathon. Like, I don't know, if people would get very angry at me and they'd say, "Who gave you permission to do this?" Which I thought was interesting, because like it's interesting that I need someone's permission to code some silly thing making fun of something I think is unjust in the world, right? And especially they said a lot of women seem to be making fun of over sexualization or things that they find to be offensive about bro culture, but how come they're allowed to do that? And so we made a certificate that, you know, gave out certificates for people to be allowed to like critique dominant culture through tech, you know. What do you think that kind of anger is about, like with people getting so angry about the sort of NFT space?
On the one hand, you have more of an open embrace, like you have all these PFPs and these kind of meme coins. You have a lot of things that are sort of on their face designed to be kind of like the stupid hackathon. And yet you still have this aspect of, you know, 98+% of the community, you know, that's making big sales are young white men. You have a lot of the same kind of toxic or exclusive behaviors kind of starting to emerge. And I don't, it's curious to me that presence of the sort of memification and the play didn't manage to wiggle in at all and kind of indicate like, hey, you know, this room isn't exactly representative of the larger sort of community and the larger revolution that we're talking about.
I don't know. I've been an artist for a long time, and I would say probably the most common question I would get, "Oh, you're an artist. How come a Picasso is worth $6 million?" Right? That's a very common thing that I would hear, and I think there is a lot of like misunderstanding, rightfully so, around the art market, and how like people can understand art in one way and then completely not understand the art market, which I think is normal. You know, it's a very weird space.
Oh, yeah.
And the more you try to explain it to people, I pretty much it like goes hand in hand with how angry they get at me. You know, and probably because I have a kind of critical way of speaking about it, which makes them mad, which I'm mad about it too, right? So I'm giving them information that's like, yeah, you think that's weird? Well, you know, like I just kind of go on about like how strange economics are in the art world, how they function in the world. Like, yes, they are a lot around, laundering money and changing assets and using assets in different ways. And the way that we understand ownership is really strange in the art world. So I do feel like there's part of that in it too, where people suddenly are not saying art, they're saying NFT, right? Like, how crazy is that? Is it really that an NFT is worth like $1 million? And what does that mean? And you're like, well, I mean, I know this is going to blow your mind, but like an idea could be worth $1 million if an artist made it. Like there's a lot, a really fantastic and interesting history around invisible art, or art that is very ephemeral. And I'm actually completely obsessed with art that is ephemeral, that is performance based, that is smell based. That's an idea. This piece exists only in your mind. But I'm only more obsessed with art that is about money, actually. Like art that uses economy and says either is playing with the concept of the art world and the art market, or is just straightforwardly aiming at capitalism and talking about using art to make it seem insane, because it is insane. And I really do appreciate a lot of the work from the artists in the 1960s who were totally tearing apart the concept of value and the market, with a lot of their conceptual art that was by design almost impossible to sell or to own or to like have a secondary market of. And a lot of them kind of got fed up and dropped out and did different weird things. I think Lee Lozano is like my favorite artist in the whole world, and she dropped out. She kind of made all this work about money and ephemera and then dropped out, and was buried in an unmarked grave. And I'm like, so punk rock. She's so punk rock. She's my hero.
I think one of the big critiques I see of NFTs is like this is just Shopify for a new crop of artists, or like, type of ascendancy to this, very, very narrow band of artists. And it's just different names for the same idea. How are you sort of, in terms of where you sit as somebody participating with NFTs and creating NFTs, where we're sitting inside one of your NFTs and or one of your art pieces backed by an NFT. How are you what's your view on that?
A lot of people, when they say it's more of the same, I push, and you didn't say that, but I'm saying, a lot of times when people say this is more of the same, I'm like, yes, but there's actually these structural differences that have been introduced. And if we don't look at them, we might even get into much worse space than we have. And this is like the super like negative Amelia is like, okay, if you say nothing has changed, that's status quo. This could be so much worse, right? But you have to notice, right? You're like, actually, it's like when people talk about surveillance capitalism, they're like, oh, but this is the same. I'm like, it is not. We have never experienced this before in human history. We've never seen the kind of consolidation of wealth and power that we've seen right now. Never. We've never seen it. So if we say it's more of the same, that's like kind of positive thinking. Right? So it's
idealistic.
But there also are some interesting things that are positive. Like on the one hand, yes, it's like hyper capitalism and it's exploding. It's completely unbridled, even by those like concepts of maybe taste or something that the 0.1% held in the art world. Like even that is just like totally, it's all gone wild. But on the other hand, the types of people and things that people are trading and thinking about is very different. And the concepts of who is allowed to participate has changed quite a bit. And I think that's really fascinating. You know what, growing up as an artist in the art world, I would hear lots of curators and art museums say that like, oh, the new donor class is going to come up and they're millennials. We need to learn how to engage with them. They did not learn how to engage with them. Like FYI, news, like they did not. And they did not start, giving direct funding to young artists and helping and supporting them and donating to museums. That did not happen. They started doing like more events and things in museums that millennials would buy tickets for or buy food at, right. But like they did not actually get millions of dollars from these donors or direct relationships like they had. Still a lot of my friends who have had the patron experience in the art world, it's still been with someone who was like much older, right? Like that whole kind of middle concept of supporting the arts has really died out. It's going to like die with the boomer class, right? So totally. This is a new way of thinking about patronage. But of course, if you're someone like me who's like a crypto anarchist, I don't believe in patronage. Like I don't want that. Like I'm like, that's cool, I guess, if you had something really invested in the like upper classes helping the select few geniuses from the lower class or whatever, but I don't care about that. So I'm like, right. I'm less interested in that and more completely thrilled by the concept of DAOs. Like, I'm like, that's freaking amazing.
So I'd love if we could kind of take that step back and maybe have you kind of tone set on what Web3 is, and then we can kind of dive back into the acronyms and the terms.
Yeah, sure. Sure. Well, decentralization was a promise of my generation. These young hackers who we were the first generation to meet the internet as teenagers and the last generation to know of a world without the internet, right? And so our belief was that the world could become a better place through decentralization because we wouldn't need the authority of governments to decide, you have one person and you're represented by this complex system. Decentralization believed in like one person, one vote, and to be able to have more of a direct autonomy, direct democracy, and direct control over financial and natural resources rather than having it be adjudicated through all these systems of oppression that we had been around. But that was our dream. And the interesting thing about Web 3.0 is it's much more similar to Web 0.010, right? Like the earliest phase of the internet, maybe even before the World Wide Web. That's what a lot of people dreamed about this technology. And even it was quite boring. It was very slow, and it was a lot of it, just text-based. And if you did try to get an image, would take hours, to download or whatnot. But so it wasn't a lot of exciting to look at. And yet it looks even aesthetically a lot more like Web 3.0 in the sense that nowadays a lot of this blockchain technology is a series of, API calls and hash numbers. And even the images that we render on the web around NFTs are part of that. But if you look at a lot of these marketplaces for NFT, they look like early websites without any CSS or anything in them. So it's interesting to me that the Web 3.0 is it has a lot of the same hopes and promises that we imagined in the early stages. However, what we were promised, that information would be free, we found that ourselves were the product, right? Like as these companies mined our data, we were not actually free, or the products were free. Information was not free because the price of it was our privacy and our autonomy. And we were promised like new economies, and we did get new economies, but we also got things like the gig economy that actually made people have less rights and live in a more precarious situation. And we were promised a lot of ways in which we could have a new democracy, but instead we find ourselves with social networks that are threatening our democracy. And so those are like the kind of issues that I think people are hoping that Web 3.0 could maybe move us past. There's a lot of ideas of moving past the ad revenue model. However, I no longer think of it as a threat. It's much more of a threat around surveillance capitalism. That's more like what I'm concerned about rather than just ads, because ads are like the quick thing that you can make a buck on, but like really mining and controlling people's behavior and thoughts and democracies is like much higher stakes.
How do you see NFTs, and more, maybe the better question here is like creators being part of a driving force in Web3, rebutting what surveillance capitalism has put in the world?
Well, every time we can kind of peel back layers of ease from the internet and remind people that it is actually something that you can understand and you can interact with, that you can create, that you could host. You could have your computer and it could host something, and that could be a website, and it actually kind of I'm going to say it again, decentralizing, right? We're going to constantly pull apart and decentralize this technology that does actually not need these FANG companies in order to operate. If we can kind of remind people of its core, remind people of its values, like why did you want this? Maybe you wanted to connect to your neighbor. Well, a website can help you connect to your neighbor, but maybe it can't if it also is radicalizing you in some way to hate your neighbor, right? So like if that's the goal, then like let's peel back these layers of saying like, if I have to connect to my neighbor by going through a FANG site that's going to radicalize me into hating my neighbor, I'm going to not use that. What are the other options that I can use? And also, a lot of it is education, of teaching people that these things can be demystified, that you can interact with them and engage with them, and you might lose some of the quick ease or prettiness of some of these spaces, and that's okay. Like that the function and your community can be a much more rewarding thing than watching a very, like high definition streamed thing, right? And I think people are okay with that too. I think it's always is why a lot of artists find themselves as early adopters, right? Because they're not afraid of those messy spaces, and so they'll try. And the nice thing about putting artists in those early tester spaces is that we bring along our communities. Like that's who we are. We're kind of this nexus point of communities, of activists, of community members. We are that inner sector that talks to a broad group of people with broad interests and like broad investments in this space. And so having us be the early prototypers means that we can kind of demystify and connect this to the needs of other people. I am excited about ways in which decentralization can help support indigenous sovereignty economies, or different ways of thinking about land ownership as it is incredibly decentralized, or you could have many different stakeholders voting in the ways in which it can be resourced or managed or protected. So I think there's a lot of really positive things there, but it does require saying what we really mean, saying what we really want, what we really demand from these things. And we can't do that through the hype. And I think the hype will always be there, and it'll be really shiny and exciting, but it's a distraction from a lot of the really good that these technologies can do. But they are aiming for the most powerful institutions we know in our planet, right? Like if you're going after the banking industry or the FANG industry, like that's threatening a lot of people's power. And so I don't think we've heard the last of the hype. I think we're going to hear a lot of terrible things about these technologies because they are a threat.
Yeah, and I think that a really great example about this, and of course it's a provocation that comes up a lot, is the energy toll that mining proof of work cryptocurrencies takes. What never gets brought up in those contexts is the energy toll that traditional banking takes,
100%.
and what having to interface with the server and cloud infrastructures that facilitate you to do easy things like Venmo take.
Absolutely.
And it's not to belittle the fact that we should be being very thoughtful about the toll our technologies take, But it's interesting and convenient that we really focused all of our ire on this new wave rather than situated it within a broader context. Like, it's interesting
Absolutely.
we did that.
Absolutely. I mean, like, same thing you said, like an API call from your credit card. We don't know how much energy that takes. But I do know that my bank and my financial institutions that run my credit cards, 100% are the people who make fossil fuel industries too big to fail. They underwrite them, they back them, they will not divest from them, right? So I do know exactly the type of economic impact they have, which is the biggest in the world, right? However, it's interesting that we're focusing on like XYZ cartoonist drawing a Pepe as being like the worst person in climate change right now, rather than like your bank and demanding that they divest from fossil fuels. And it's true that any blockchain that we use, whether they're proof of stake or proof of work, they do use supercomputing power that does take energy. And it is important that we make sure that those become incredibly efficient and that we constantly are prototyping and making our systems better to not be dependent in any way on fossil fuel. However, that's like a slight difference than being the people who are actually bankrolling the fossil fuel companies to actively pollute our planet.
When you think about governance in a context of people who maybe have never stood up any type of governing body before, what are the challenges that you see, and what are the possibilities that you see, potentially emerging from that could even one day perhaps take on a Chevron or a bankrolling a Chevron? I'm not calling out Chevron in particular, but you know what I mean.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, no, there's a lot of really exciting things about DAOs and having some of these things backed by technology that can make what was very complicated in the past to do easier, right? Or can facilitate millions of people coming to an accord or agreement, or working asynchronously towards a list of protocols and governance, right? Like, growing up as an anarchist, I think that people would have a really large critique of it, saying like, that's all fine and good, but the world is really big and that would only really work for a small intentional community of 20 or 30, because how would you manage? And it's like, actually, technology has made it so that it's a much bigger question as to why don't we have one person, one vote in this country? Like, are you really telling me, like, we go and we do these electronic voting in a box, but you're really telling me we couldn't just allow everyone to vote? Like, if we wanted to, then we could. And so clearly the issue is that we don't want them to, right? And so I think that is exciting. It's also exciting to think about not just one person, one vote, but the systems, the non-human systems like our air and our water and animals having their own lobby and their own voting block to make sure that they can protect themselves. And we can write those things into, our DAOs and into our contracts, into our governance. I like to say that, it's only been 500 years in the United States when we've had those non-human systems not represented in our government. Before then, Indigenous people took great concern to think about them in their governance structures. And we had Confederate democracies and our own pre-Columbian blockchain that we used for thousands of years of peace, and were able to, live in harmony with nature and not extract the value to the point where we had to move anywhere. We could continue to farm and feed people, and we did not have slavery or things like that you need when you have extracted too much resources and all of that. So like we've been able to do that for thousands of years in the US, and it's only been a short amount of time we've kind of not been able to do that. So I think I feel very positive that with these new technologies we can kind of get back there. We can begin to start allowing all of our people and all of our natural systems to have a voice in the sustainability and survival of our planet.
And like, I think there's one interesting thing with games and filmmaking, because you obviously have a deep history in games that then kind of brings you into VR, AR, and I mean, you're a Renaissance person of the finest order. But I think there's something really special in thinking about the creative process with games and film and TV. How are you seeing NFTs in sort of a Web3 context?
Oh, such a great question. I mean, I love that a lot of people have thought about DAOs or thinking about DAOs as the new types of unions. And I think it's true that unions didn't, I mean, there's obviously they've been under attack in this country for a long time. And so it's not necessarily just the fault of unions, but a lot of them haven't evolved to include the kind of people that need to be included in these discussions. So I do believe that these systems could replace or augment or help and assist the concept of unions in these practical spaces. Just from like a very small example from the girl that I was talking to earlier today, I was like, great, we'll do this collaboration. I'm showing her how to get, onto the blockchain and showing her how to do an NFT and everything. And then I'm like, and there we go. We just split it and now we have the royalties. And she's like, wow. And we didn't need a lawyer, right? Like she's, a famous filmmaker and does amazing things. So she's used to having the sending it back, having our lawyers check all of that. And she's like, this is great, right? Like she just immediately got that this is, oh, okay, yeah, this is great. I understand this. And she's a professional and can feel kind of comfortable that we've talked and we've worked this out. And then here's our contract. And there you go. And I think that's like a small example, but it can kind of help someone who's interested in this space. Like, why would you maybe want to do this? And if you imagine, rather than it just being two women, but like 300,000 women could do the same thing, right? We could decide how we work together and collectively organize and co-create together, and also support each other, right? And with different mediums. I have a group called no-funding.com, which is a mutual aid network for creatives. And we talk about this stuff kind of every week about like, what would life be like if we weren't clamoring for some type of approval or funding, or like, what would we make if we didn't have to impress funders? Like, what would we make just for each other? And can we just crowdsource through these new platforms with each other and for each other? Like, can this really be by us and for us?
Yeah, it's such an incredible idea, because we really are at a precipice where we ought to be living with an attitude of abundance. Like, given the technologies and the interconnectedness that's available to us, there's no reason that we shouldn't be operating from a place of abundance. And I'm not wanting to fall into the trap of saying that it's the individual's responsibility. Of course, like, there are powerful systems designed specifically to keep us from sort of recognizing that and claiming that. But there's actually lots of reason why we should, in the face of that, kind of grab that and just see what emerges. Because, and there's a paradox too, I'm sort of interrupting myself, but there's a paradox with it, because what has sort of put this conversation to the fore is the NFT, which foregrounds scarcity, or at least the sort of rhetoric around it has foregrounded scarcity. But I view that as a sort of, again, a Trojan horse that kind of busts open the doors of your thinking. I don't view the sort of non-fungible token as the thing. It's the invitation. It's the, okay, we can now establish discrete units of virtual stuff. Yeah. Great. Let's go from non-fungible back to fungible. Let's have all the different types of like weird fungibility that we can have, because that's where the abundance lives. And so creating networks of community care is, like, to me, it's a thing that it's not going to get headlines. It's not the $70 million sale. Yeah. But to me, that's the thing. It's actually a very simple thing. It's like it's a first principles thing. It's like, do you want to live in a context where people care for each other? And I know that it's so hokey sounding, but it's like, but we actually don't right now. Like, the context we live in right now is driven by scarcity and fear. Yeah. And so it's almost like, use the occasion of NFTs and the dialogue around web3 to actually see if you can institute structures that are outside of your comfort zone, but that foreground community care rather than sort of individual success. And that's exactly what you're doing.
And I think people don't realize how, like, deeply problematic or racist a lot of our economic systems are, right? Like, being able to get a loan for a house, like, depending on which racial box you check, really matters, right? It really could be the difference between if you get a loan or if you don't in certain areas. And you're going back to, do we need to repeal all of these like Jim Crow era laws in our countries, or can we create different systems of just like, if the problem is someone needs a house, is there a way that we can actually use these systems and recreate ways of giving and lending that are just like, okay, maybe you're not going to repeal your Jim Crow laws, but like, we now have a different people's bank that allows people to get loans for houses, and it doesn't matter like what color they are. And you and I can be part of that DAO that creates that governance system and decides on how to lend money to people.
I guess the last thing that I'd love to just like learn from you and know from you is what's really exciting you at the moment. And I know from past conversations that the notion of land back is really driving your practice. So I kind of want to flag that as something that I'd love you to share a little bit about. But yeah, kind of open up, kind of carrying this last bit. Obviously there's a lot of skepticism and fear, but what are things that are really kind of driving you and exciting you and causing you to, drive further and deeper and faster.
Well, I am so inspired by what Indigenous people are doing all over the world for land back. My favorite group in the U.S. is Indian Collective. I like sing their praises at every group that I do, and I want so much to be able to give back to that community and that mindset of thinking of custodianship. And the way that we care for the planet rather than the kind of ownership that we think about now. And that's where I think the possibility for land back plus blockchain equals climate justice, because you can imagine that you could have millions of people that organize together to purchase mineral rights and stop pipelines. You have people that could purchase land and turn it into a trust that's stewarded by indigenous communities of that area that is their ancestral homeland. And people say often, but it's complicated. There's tons of different nations that would claim that land. I'm like, great, complicated is great on the blockchain. You can actually do that, right? Like all of these nuances that you may need where people don't just own land but need to travel through it and need to migrate through it or need to have their animals like pass through it. All of those things could be governed through contracts that are negotiated in this way and that are voted by all of the people that it impacts, right? And so I do think there's an enormous opportunity. I always, whenever I give a talk, I always say, like, if this means something to you, give me a call, because I have a climate justice lab at the University of Florida, and if you're doing things like this, I want to help, or I want to be a part of it, or give you a platform or anything, because I know I'm not alone. I know there's a lot of people thinking about this in the space, but it does take a little bit of education. People will be like, okay, first of all, but what is blockchain and what is land back? And then they're like, I get this. 80% of the world's biodiversity is on land that is stewarded by indigenous people, even though we only make up 6% of the world. So, indigenous sovereignty really is not just racial justice, but climate justice, and it's important. And I think that a lot of people in tech who are excited about these new technologies, I think a lot of them want to do good, and I think we have to kind of, dismantle some of these, some institutional racism and settler colonialism to kind of help them see the best ways forward. People definitely have left us out of the conversation for a long time, and I think climate justice is definitely a repercussion of that, and it can be something that can hopefully move us in the right direction, since we don't have a lot of time to save our planet. So,
truly,
yeah,
truly cool.
but I don't know. I love the way that you said that these spaces, these new technologies, are like the what if, the dreaming space, and I think that's why I always live here in this area code of the recently possible, because I really want to use my imagination to imagine a better world and to find a way that through love and justice we can bring our neighbors and our community along with us. I do find a lot of dreamers in this space that want the same thing. I think maybe we just need to continue to be harsh critics of spaces that try to come in and colonize this beautiful future we're trying to build.